Hello everybody and welcome to another video in the Simplified opening series. This week we continue the theme of the English opening. Now if you remember the previous video that I published last week, there we spoke about one line that Black can employ against the English opening. And as I explained, that line was one of the main reasons why I chose not to recommend the G3 lines against the reverse Sicilian setup against the English in my 1C4 Simplified Chessable course. Now, as I was working on that course, obviously I had to go over a lot of lines in the English opening. And in this video, I would like to demonstrate one that I was thinking very hard whether to mention or even recommend in my course. And eventually I decided against it. But okay, that doesn't stop me from presenting the findings in this video on my channel. So the line in question is actually very interesting, and I would also have to add a bit risky for white, but it leads to quite an unexplored and adventurous positions that are, I think, very good for, well, playing for a win or even just trying to steer the game to less well-trodden paths. So what is this line that I had in mind? So after c4 e5, as you can see in the prompt in the text, it's already move 2, so this is where the move comes into play. And before just playing the move, I will add that apart from the standard move knight c3, which is also the one in the course, white has recently started playing moves like d3 or even a3, just trying to get the game into some reversed Najdorf, Scheveningen, classical Sicilian. And okay, it's a possible way to play the English opening, but I mentioned this because the move I'm going to show you now is also a reversed Sicilian, basically. And that move is the move knight f3. So I explored this quite a bit while working on the course, and it's a very exciting line. But I will tell you a bit later why eventually I decided not to mention it or recommend it in the course. So the move knight f3 in fact is a reversed Nimzowitsch Sicilian, which goes e4 c5, knight f3, knight f6, provoking the e pawn to move further, e4 to attack the knight in this case. But here white, being white, is a whole tempo up compared to the Nimzowitsch Sicilian, in which case black there white would have already a knight on f6. So here the logic is that, okay, if that Nimzowitsch Sicilian is not the worst Sicilian for black, then perhaps here with the tempo up things can work for white as well. And they do, in fact, but things are getting quite interesting. So knight f3, the pawn is attacked, so the critical move is obviously the move e4, and we will pay our attention to that move the most. But before continuing, to give you a better overview, kind of almost like a repertoire if you decide to adopt this line, let's take a look at the other two moves, how black can defend actually that pawn on e5, which are the moves knight c6 and d6. So after d6, best is to just advance in the center with d4, attacking the pawn, and in case of e4, then knight g5, attacking the pawn on e4, and f5, h4. And what we are getting here is that knight will drop back to h3, and after bishop f4, knight f4, followed by e3, white will actually have a very good central control of the dark squares, e3, f4, g5. Okay, that's not that central, but good control over the dark squares, and a pleasant reversed French structure. So d6 actually, black could play maybe knight d7 here, okay, and so forth, when white can decide which setup to choose, maybe go for e3 stuff or g3 stuff, or maybe King's Indian stuff with d4, depending, yeah. But if you want some independent play, you can just go knight c3 and e3 and bishop e2 and just play it safe, yeah. So this is obviously not critical. Knight c6 is a bit better, but again, the same idea with d4 works. Now black can choose whether to, okay, defending now with d6 just allows d5 and e4 with an excellent position for white, because black is many tempi down compared to the King's Indian. So the main moves here are either advancing with e4, or taking on d4. So advancing with e4, after knight fd2, white attacks the pawn on e4, so knight d4, knight d4 would be in white's favor. So f5, defending the pawn. Now knight c3, still knight d4 is met by knight d4, and then the queen is attacking the knight on d4, knight f6. And now this is a position actually that I analyze in my course, and which is reached by a different move order. And here in the course, for example, I recommend the very interesting and visually curious move knight db1. Of course, the move, nothing wrong with the move e3, but I like knight db1 because it creates this, let's say, positional idea of going bishop g5, okay, getting rid of the dark squared bishop before playing e3, okay, and reaching this reversed French structure. So after bishop g5, get rid of the bishop, play e3, and then it's a comfortable reversed French for white. So that's e4, and in case of ed4, knight d4, again there is a choice for black. For example, if bishop b4 check, bishop d2, bishop d2, queen d2, and then just simple development knight c3. And if you're feeling aggressive, you can even follow up with e4 and long castle, yeah, and then start attack with f3, g4, and so forth on the black's king side. Another natural move is the move knight f6, but now just simplistic take on c6, bc, and play g3. And again, this is quite pleasant for white. Bishop g2, castles, knight c3, and then maybe b3, bishop b2, or the bishop goes to f4 or g5, depending on circumstances, queen on d2 or c2. Rooks are coming to d1 and c1. There is pressure on the long diagonal, so d6 is a bit problematic for black to achieve unless he plays it immediately. But then there will be pressure on the c6 pawn. Again, quite pleasant, risk-free, I would say, play for white. So the more or less the only move that remains is the move bishop c5. And now, well, the engine's move here, which is actually a novelty, would be the move knight f3, intending to follow up with knight c3. Okay, and then if bishop b4, bishop d2 to avoid the pin, and then jumping to d5. You can explore this a little bit. That's the engine's preference. But I think more natural are the other two moves. The important thing here is not to run into the trick knight c6, which was working against knight f6, but here it doesn't work because black has the intermediate move queen f6, threatening this nasty capture on f2, and at the same time, after e3, dc6, the bishop gets developed and the rook is coming to the open file, and black has quite a good initiative. So there's the small trick when bishop c5 is played. Like I said, knight f3 works, knight b3 works, if bishop b4, bishop d2, that's one idea. And probably the simplest is to just go e3. So knight f6, bishop e2, castles, castles. Yeah, and now if black doesn't go d5, he goes something like d6. Plays really simple, knight goes to c3, b3, bishop b2. Yeah, queen comes to d2, rook d1, maybe bishop f3. Knight comes to d5 at some point. Very simple play for white. Whereas in case of d5, then knight c6, bc6, and queen c2. And again, play is very simple also development, b3, bishop b2, then knight c3, most likely rooks coming to d1 and c1, maybe bishop f3, and play is also very simple because it's all about these c6, d5 pawns in the center, cd5 at some point, maybe knight f4, pressure on the c file. Again, quite straightforward play for white. So this is the move knight c6, yeah. Perfectly possible, but not critical. So let's check the critical move, e4, now knight d4, and knight c6. This is exactly the same as in the Nimzovich Sicilian, when white plays the move knight c3 in the actually the reversed position. And it is the best move for black here as well. Note that the move d5 immediately after cd5, queen d5, e3. It's possible, but this is another reverse Sicilian, which is the Alapin, where black has taken on d5 with the queen, and we have these lines when white takes on d4 with the queen. But being a tempo up, this is pleasant for white. After knight f6, knight c3, queen d8, it's possible to play d3, but I like this plan of queen c2, targeting the pawn on e4, which can further be attacked by knight d2, knight g3, attacking it 3 times. b3, bishop b2 is development of the dark squared bishop, and white will have really smooth development of all the pieces. and will attack this advanced pawn on e4, which, if necessary, can always be exchanged by a move like d3. So d5 is not critical. Knight c6 is the critical move. And here we come to the position where, let's say, opinions diverge. Yeah. Why do I say this? Well, the thing is that here we have a move that is objectively the better one, which is the move e3. It has been played by strong players. But that's not the move I wanted to recommend, or I want to recommend maybe in this video. This I will leave to you because I will present the analysis of both moves, both e3, and the move I think is the more, let's say, fighting or practical one, which is the move knight c6. And here comes the dilemma that I had when working on the course. The point with this move knight c6, which like I say, I wanted to recommend ahead of e3, is that after d takes c6, which is the correct recapture because bc d4 is just fine for or queen c2, yeah, knight f6 c3, and then b3 bishop b2 and so forth. This is good for white. But d c6, the point is that these positions the computer loves for black and always gives some very solid advantage. So if whenever you look at these positions with an engine, they'll give you like something between 0.5 to 0.8 or 9 in black's favor. And I was thinking, okay, if I recommend that, people will switch their engines on and they'll look like, what is this guy talking about? Why is he recommending this rubbish, right? But things are not that simple. And this is maybe one of those cases where an engine would obviously play the position perfectly and maybe even justify that kind of an evaluation. But I had my reasons, and I will explain them now why I thought that this is perhaps not that bad for white as the engine may suggest. So let's make some moves. Knight c3, attacking the pawn on e4, knight f6, e3. Yeah. Again, d4 is the let's say objectively better move, but after ed bishop c5, black is just doing great, yeah, with this control over d4. So we go e3, bishop f5, and now we play the move queen b3, attacking the pawn on b7. So this is, let's say, the starting position of the variation. So how I came to the idea first. Well, when I was working on my 1e4 course for white, we had a bit of a history. I had to, of course, deal with the Nimzowitsch Sicilian e4 c5, knight f3, knight f6. And while I was analyzing those, the theory of that line, I noticed that there are a lot of games for black in that line by Grandmaster Alexander Rachmanov. And he was treating these positions in a very interesting and quite convincing, I would say, manner. And again, the engine was giving a huge advantage for white in the Sicilian, yeah. But Rachmanov didn't matter at all. He was playing his plans and he was having great results. So then I thought, okay, wait a bit. Tempo up with white. Why not try this with the colors reversed? And let's see if Rachmanov's plans are applicable. And for sure they are. And now I'm going to show you these plans and why I think this is a kind of an interesting practical try, at least for white. For those who intend to take up on this variation, I would recommend again to study Rachmanov's games in the Sicilian with black, but also with white, because logically Rachmanov, being a strong grandmaster around 2600, hopping up and above and below 2600, he also implements this line with white. So he's just using his knowledge from the Sicilian to implement it in the English opening. So study his games both with white in this variation and also with black in the Nimzowitsch Sicilian. Now the point of white's play here is actually quite simple. The first idea with queen b3 is to kind of try to provoke this weakening of the queen side by playing b6. I will give you illustrative lines here with both options. Yeah, when black plays b6, it doesn't play b6, but this does not really alter white's plans. So speaking generally, white's plan is to, after whatever black does, b6 or queen c8, to drop the queen back to c2, go b3 and bishop b2, and then the development is finished. So all the pieces are well developed. Okay, the bishop can always come to e2. And then white's plan depends on where black castles. Now, if black castles short, okay, white wants to start attack with h3 and g4. If black castles long, white wants to start an attack there with a3, b4, and c5. And this is pretty much about it. There is also a third option, okay, which is after white going long castle, let's say, to go d3 and eliminate this pawn on e4, in which case white will have the better structure, these four pawns on the king side and center against black's 3, and black is left with a double pawn on the queen side, 4 against 3, where he cannot create a passed pawn. So these are the plans for white. Wait for black to castle one side and start attacking there. Okay, it sounds really too simplistic, but it tends to work in practice. What doesn't really look good when looking at this line is that the engine is just laughing and saying, okay, black is so much better. Well, that may be so, objective truth or whatever, but in practice, white's results haven't been that bad, especially for Rachmanov. So let me show you a couple of lines. So let's start with queen c8, trying not to weaken the queen side with b6. So h3, useful move. I mentioned that g4 and advancing on the king side is one of white's ideas, especially as in those variations when black castles short. So h5 is an idea that stops g4. Okay, and now dropping back to the usual development, queen c2. So now there is intending, of course, b3, bishop b2. Now there is no attack on b7, so queen d7, b3, now long castle. Yeah, so here we can take a look at how white plays on the queen side when black castles long. I already mentioned how the idea is to advance a3, b4, and then go c5. I will explain this in a bit. So a3, h4, b4, and in this position, we are following the game Rachmanov-Cotronias from 2016. In this position, the computer suggests the move c5 in order to stop white's c5. Now, why does white want to play c5? The idea with c5 is to establish a knight on d4. Okay, so to secure the d4 square. So bishop b2, knight e2, knight d4. That's the maneuver that white is aiming for. And with a knight on d4, then a further attack with b5 on the queen side may be possible. So that's why the engine here suggests c5. Okay, and something like, let's say, bishop b2, rook h6, and now knight e2. Still the same idea, only that white wants to take on c5 now and go knight d4. Yeah, it's not quite the same because c5 would be preferable, yeah, but still possible. The funny thing is that after, let's say, something with king b8, bc5, bishop c5, knight d4, the computer gives a huge advantage to black. Okay, maybe so, but I still think this is, well, it doesn't look that it's too bad for white, at least, yeah. And I think it's actually quite playable. But in the game, Cotronias went rook h6, allowing c5, and after g5, now best for white would have been to go knight e2, and then go, like I explained, bishop b2, knight d4, and then possibly b5 and continue attack on the queen side. So this is a typical, let's say, more or less development of the middle game, and I think the good part for white is that it's practically impossible for black to avoid this type of scenario and this type of play, because white's plan basically cannot be stopped. It's either black plays c5 or white plays c5, and that's the only difference there is. Now let me give you another illustrative line. After, let's say, b6 here, queen c2, and an illustrative line, what happens if black castles short? Let's say bishop c5, h3, preparing g4 at some point, perhaps h5, b3 now, queen e7, bishop b2, a5, bishop e2. So white is waiting. Yeah, where does black go? Don't forget that white still has this idea of d3 or d4, getting rid of the pawn on e4. And in case black castles short, then g4 is fantastic already for white. It's a pawn sacrifice, but after a long castle, rook dg1, the attack will likely be winning. And just all the pieces will be attacking. So this is a typical idea for white as well. And again, if black castles long, let's say queen d7, h3, long castle, yeah, we know the plan. a3, b4, c5. So a3, h5, b4. And again, according to the engine, best here is to go c5, yeah, not allow white to play c5, but after bishop c5, bc5, bishop c5, knight a4, the knight doesn't go to d4, but in fact attacks the bishop, and white intends to push through c5 and continue with the attack on the queen side. So again, a pretty unclear position, yeah, even though the engine, like I say, prefers black. Whereas if black allows it with a move like queen e6, then c5, we already know the drill. Bishop comes to b2, knight e2, knight d4, and again quite a good position for white. And again, I would say in spite of what the engine claims. So now you understand perhaps better my thinking and my reasoning why I was kind of so hesitant to propose this in my course. And eventually I decided against it because I think the influence of the engine's evaluation is very strong on players nowadays. That includes me, that includes all the top players in the world. But and for this reason, I just decided, okay, not to make people nervous, having to play a position where the engine is so strongly against them. But okay, that's why I chose to present this idea in my video. It's a free video. You can use it as you see it fit. You can use it or not. You can form your own decision. But I just thought it's an interesting attempt, and I thought it deserves to be presented as I did. So this is the line I had in mind. Now with all this, okay, as I promised at the beginning, I will give you also an overview of the, let's say, the theoretically better move, and that is the move e3. This, like I said, it's objectively better. The engine likes white here, so you choose your own weapon. After e3, it has been played by strong people. Black needs to decide, does he take on d4 or just continues development with knight f6. In the high-level game, Giri Ding Liren, played in 2020 on the internet, Ding actually played the move queen f6, attacking the knight on d4, but after knight b5, hitting c7, was forced to go back. Yeah, and after d3, already white was somewhat better here. Okay, some development advantage. Yeah, and okay, this obviously is not how black should play, wasting 2 tempi in the opening. So let's check the critical move knight d4 and the developing move, let's say knight f6. I say critical knight d4 e4 because after queen f6, white is more or less forced to sacrifice a pawn, because d5 bishop c5 is just good for black. So bishop e2, queen d4, short castle. And the point is that here white has actually quite a good compensation. It's not enough for an advantage, but it gives him the initiative. So knight f6 here is a developing move. For example, if in case of something like d5, cd5, bishop f5, intending long castle, white is in time to stop that by giving this check on b5. Yeah, and this forces king b8, and this obviously gives white compensation with that king stuck in the center. So knight f6 and now d3. Yeah. And the idea is obviously to play for quick development, knight c3, rook e1, maybe bishop e3, depending on circumstances. Yeah, and like I said, the initiative is quite sufficient for compensation for the pawn. So let's say ed3, bishop d3, bishop e7, and knight c3. The problem for black is that he must spend a tempo either removing the queen or not castling, because castling bishop h7 would be quite embarrassing, as white wins the queen. And otherwise, let's say d6, rook e1, there is pin on the e-file, yeah, and black's king is stuck in the center for the time being. So that's a simple line, for example, that shows you the compensation that white has. In fact, here black's best move is the move bishop c5, developing but defending the queen. So now this trick of let's say knight c3, ed3, bishop d3 castling is possible because bishop h7 doesn't work, as the queen on d4 is defended. Bishop g5 doesn't work, but bishop h7 doesn't work, but bishop g5 does. White simply develops, yeah. And the idea is to go queen c2, rook d1, then threatening bishop h7, yeah, maybe rook e1, with good play in the center, thanks to the active pieces. So it's a objectively equalish position where black has a pawn and white has the initiative and the advantage in development. So this is the That's why I said this is a critical line when black grabs the pawn, but white gets free piece play. So let's go back now and check the line after knight f6, knight c3 by white. And here black has a wider choice. Okay. Um, all of black's moves lead to positions that are less standard, okay, and that do give good chances to outplay one's opponent, especially if the lines are, well, the positions are well understood and analyzed. So let me give you an overview. Let's start with the move bishop c5, developing move, okay, attacking the knight on d4, and here knight f5, moving away and attacking g7. It's also possible to drop back to e2 because in both lines the knight is going to g3, yeah, and going after this pawn on e4. So let's say knight f5, castles, knight g3, attacking the pawn on e4, rook e8 and a3. Okay, intending some expansion with b4. And this type of position, in fact, is quite good for white because he has very smooth development. Queen comes to c2. There is immense pressure on that pawn on e4. And the bishop will come to the long diagonal. And very quickly, by playing, let's say, natural moves, I will show you a game played between Barat and Vidit, where in mere 15 moves, Vidit was, according to the engine, lost. Okay, playing natural moves along the way. So let's see, a5 makes sense, yeah, stopping b4, queen c2, attacking the pawn on e4, queen e7, defending the pawn, and b3. And the bishop goes to b2, yeah, then the other one comes to e2, short castle, and then white will see what to do. One of the ideas is to go f3, and this will happen very nicely in the game. So d6, bishop b2, bishop d7, bishop e2, bishop b6. Looks very natural, very smooth for black, but in fact he's in trouble already. Castles, h6, rook ac1. This wasn't really necessary, f3 was possible, but it's fine. Let's say queen e6, and now an improvement over that game, where white played rook fe1, f3 is much stronger. And this gives you a better understanding why this is problematic for black, because after e f3, bishop f3, white indeed has a fantastic position. Excellent central control. Knight comes to d5, knight comes to f5, yeah. Bishops are excellent on the long diagonals. Okay, excellent control of the d5 square. And black's problem is that this dead bishop on b6, because this small pawn chain d to e3 effectively kills off any counterplay that black may have in the center, both on the e file and on the g1 h7 diagonal. So the bishop is dead, hitting on e3, as are the heavy pieces on the e file. Here I think the engine already gives +2 for white, which is tremendous, and you wouldn't expect it. Yeah, of course play remains, but these factors give white a very good advantage. So that's the move bishop c5. Yeah. Going back, let's say knight e5 is a curious move, yeah, intending immediately to take advantage of that d3 hole. Now f4 is good. Now ef3 is good for white, because after knight f3, queen f3, white just goes d4, e4, and obtains a fantastic center, bishop d3, short castle, in amazing position from the start. So black should go knight d3 check, bishop d3, e d3, and castles. And another very curious position. Again, white will have smooth development after b3, bishop b2, no bad pieces. Yeah. Black has the bishop pair, and this pawn on d3 can be strong, can be weak, depends. Yeah, and this basically means that the middle game that will come is pretty unclear. So d5, cd5, knight d5, and now two options. Yeah, in the game Grishchuk Caruana, played in the 2021, Grishchuk took on d5, queen d5 played b4. The point being that bishop b4, queen a4, check wins the bishop, so the pawn cannot be taken, and the pawn makes sure that c5 is always made by bc5, so the knight is stable on d4. So b6, bishop b2, bishop b7, rook f2 with a pretty big mess. Yeah, both sides have their trumps. White has a very strong knight, free play with the pieces. Black has the good control over the light squares, long diagonal pressure that white neutralizes with the rook on f2. Pretty unclear play ahead. There is also an alternative to knight d5, which is queen h5, attacking that knight on d5. And now black can go to f6, go dropping back, after which queen e5 check and knight db5 hits the pawn on c7, just to show you knight f6, queen e5 check, knight bishop e7, knight db5. And now there are some issues with the pawn. Black should sacrifice it, but white is, I would say, somewhat better, even though black has some compensation there. And the alternative is to take on c3, bc3, c5, knight f3, bishop e7, and now c4. It's so important to open the long diagonal. So bishop b2, knight e5, and again, very unclear position with chances for both sides, but quite a playable one and unusual one. So that's the move 95. Yeah. After which white goes f4. There is knight d4 now also, and this is maybe the only line where we have some sort of a normalish position. Yeah, ed4, d5, d3, ed3, bishop d3, dc4, bishop c4, and we landed in this standard, let's say, IQP position, only with one pair of knights exchanged. Otherwise, this position can arise from the Petrov, from the Queen's Gambit accepted, with knights on f3, let's say, and b8. But here those knights are gone. And this simply, as it's usual in these positions, gives white free play. Let's say bishop e7, castles, rook e1, c6, and h3. Yeah, and then the queen will come to b3, pressure on f7, pressure on b7. The bishop can be developed to f4, rook a d1. Yeah, just free play for white. Slightly better probably for white as well. Yeah. So this is possible, but nothing spectacular for black. Yeah. So that's knight d4. And the final move to check is the move bishop b4. Yeah, after which white goes queen b3, threatening knight c6 and queen b4. Yeah. So now going back to c5 is a loss of tempo, and white can continue in the same way. Knight f5, dropping back to g3, queen drops back to c2. We may even have a transposition. So knight d4, ed4 should be checked. Yeah, and now the move a5. Defending the bishop, a3, forcing the exchange, bishop takes c3, and now d takes c3. And queen c3, d5 is just black obtains very good play in the center. But with dc3, the bishop is open, and we have quite a strange queenside structure here for white. Yeah, I have never seen this before, checking this line. So a4, queen c2, and now in the high-level game, Van Forest Giri, played in 2020 on the internet, it's amazing how quickly, in like 4 more moves, Giri was in big trouble. And again, making natural moves. So he started with h6, stopping possible pin with bishop g5, bishop e2, normal development, d6, h3, important move to control the g4 square. Yeah, so there is no some knight g4, bishop g4 when the bishop comes to e3, for example, and also prepares the move g4. And this is the key move for white in this variation. So bishop f5, bishop e3, bishop g6, and g4. And already big advantage for white, according to the engine. It's also understandable why. White will castle long and then just attack on the king side. h4, g5, h5, and so forth. Pair of bishops, attack, clear-cut plan, safe king, yeah, which cannot be said for black. For black, yeah, because the king cannot go long, a4 will always hang, and short is subject to this attack on the king side. And not surprised that Van Forest won quite convincingly. So if it's problematic for Giri, I'm pretty sure it's problematic for everybody else facing this line. So there you go. I presented both lines, that the one I had in mind initially with knight c6, but to give you a backup option or maybe even a main option, I also explored the theoretically proved, let's say, move e3 in the position after knight c6. And I think it's a very interesting line for white, this c45 knight f3, as it's kind of still fresh, unexplored, and I hope this analysis gives you some starting push, yeah, maybe to explore it on your own and see if it's good enough to use in your own games. So guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this analysis and another shortcut as early as move 2, this time for white. I hope you liked it. Now it's time for me to do the cowboy thing Hikaru Cowboy thing. Smash that subscribe button. Hope you like this video. Leave your comments in the comment section. Tell me what you think. And well, stay safe. See you soon with next week. In the meantime, it will be shorts time. Take care.